Good afternoon and welcome to today's event hosted by the Student Borrower Protection Center and the National Young Farmers Coalition. Crisis on the Farm: How Student Debt is Impacting Rural Communities and Affecting Plans for a New Generation of Farmers. To begin today's event, SBPC Executive Director Seth Frotman will deliver opening remarks. Seth?
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I'm thrilled to be here with so many advocates for student loan borrowers, including Representative Antonio Delgado, Young Farmers Executive Director Sophie Akoff, and two young farmers, John Williams and Melanie Edwards, to discuss how student debt uniquely harms farmers and rural communities. When covering America's $1.7 trillion student debt crisis, talking heads often fall back on tired cliches, depicting student loan borrowers as high-income elites eating avocado toast in America's cities. For millions of farmers and rural borrowers struggling under the weight of student debt, this caricature cannot be further from the truth. Recent estimates indicate that 6.5 million people in rural areas across the country each owe an average of $35,000 in student loan debt. And these borrowers are struggling. As many as 1.1 million rural student loan borrowers have fallen into delinquency or default, a rate that is higher than the national average. Rural borrowers also struggle to access the credit they need to start a farm. And research from the National Young Farmers Coalition shows that almost 1 in 3 young farmers ultimately did not pursue farming or waited to start farming because his or her student loan debt made doing so unaffordable. The consequences of the massive burden of student loan debt ripples across entire rural communities. Research shows that student debt accelerates outmigration from rural areas, and that those borrowers who do remain in rural communities struggle more across their financial lives. All of that gets lost when we continue thinking of the student debt crisis as just being a crisis for urban elites. In short, today's conversation about student loan debt and the unique challenges it poses for rural borrowers and farmers is long overdue. Thank you once again to our panelists and to those tuning in at home. Now, Representative Delgado will kick off our event with a few opening remarks.
Hello, everybody. Congressman Delgado here. It is good to be with you all virtually at your forum. Excited to share a few words about Congressman Delgado. Hello, everybody. Congressman Delgado here. It is good to be with you all virtually at your forum. Excited to share a few words about our common cause. I do want to thank Vanessa Garcia Polanco for the invitation to speak. I also want to give a special shout out to Sophie Akoff, who is a true advocate for our young farmers. She sits on my locally based advisory committee for farming and agriculture all throughout New York 19, and she is a consistent presence and voice on that committee. So shout out to Sophie. Listen, I think I should start from the fact that my district is the 8th most rural congressional district in the entire country. That's 8 out of 435 seats. And yet, when you look at some of the trend lines and biases coming out of Washington, too many of our rural communities and our family-owned farms therein have been overlooked by what's happening in Washington. I'll give you a perfect example when it comes to the bias against our rural communities. When we got the CARES Act passed in March of last year, the state and local funding that came through directly from the federal government was tied to a population threshold of 500,000 people. So any town, any county, any village with a population less than 500,000 did not see any direct aid or support. That's why I introduced the Direct Support for Communities Act last May. We got it in the HEROES Act, we got it in HEROES 2, but it kept stalling in the Senate. Thankfully, we were able to get my funding formula in the American Rescue Plan. And as a result, we have $130.2 billion going to local governments all across the country, irrespective of population size. In fact, In New York 19, over $400 million is going to our local governments. This will ensure that every community, including our most rural communities, have what they need to invest in their future and sustain themselves through these incredibly challenging times, whether it's upgrading wastewater management systems, building out that last mile of broadband, supporting our young farmers or our nonprofits, or supporting our small businesses, whatever it takes to propel that community to the future. And it does it in a way where the federal government isn't being this top-down siloed enterprise. The money is going directly to the community, and we're empowering folks on the ground with situational awareness who know best what to do with those resources. It's also important as we move forward that we figure out ways to make it more possible for folks to stay in rural communities, particularly our young people. That means forgiving student debt. It means incentivizing loan repayment programs. All of this is very important to maintaining the integrity of our rural communities. Listen, upstate New York is home to some of the best colleges in the world, particularly our community colleges all throughout New York 19. But our towns and our villages are continuing to see students leave, and take their families with them. And as a result, we're struggling. We're struggling to maintain that workforce. It is important that we maintain a young professional workforce, and that's both in the small business space, in the farming space, you name it. And so making sure that we have programs that do that work is going to be a key component to building our rural communities to be sustainable for the future. On that note, I introduced the Rural Revitalization Now Act. This would help ease the burden of student debt and encourage folks to settle down, find employment, and raise a family right in upstate New York. The legislation creates a program that will provide borrowers with student debt relief on their federal or private student loans if they simply live in a very rural area or small or mid-sized community that is losing population. It's that simple. I also want to acknowledge the fact that if we are going to do this work, we got to make sure that we're thinking of farming as well as a public good, a public service. And that's why I introduced, or co-led, I should say, a bill last cycle called the Young Farmers Success Act. You all know it well. A bipartisan bill to make farmers and ranchers eligible for public service loan forgiveness programs. Being able to assist our young people in this fashion, whether it's through direct federal dollars like I've detailed with the Direct Support for Communities Act, or whether it's through loan forgiveness programs that we're able to champion as I've laid out here, this to me is the way forward. It has to be a priority, and it's certainly mine as we move forward to tackle our future. Listen, I know there's a lot going on right now. There's a lot of divisiveness, a lot of partisanship in our politics, but I do see a lot of potential for common ground when it comes to supporting our agricultural community, and particularly our young farmers. And I want to lead that fight. And I'm so happy to be able to be an advocate for the great work that all of you do. So please continue to count on me to do that work. I'll keep pushing for solutions. Stay safe, stay healthy. God bless.
Thank you once again to Representative Delgado, such an important and powerful voice. Now I'd like to introduce our panelists today. Sophie Ackoff, the Executive Director of the National Young Farmers Coalition, John Williams, Farm Manager at Sola Gradia Farm in Urbana, Illinois, and Melanie Edwards, a farmer at Ebony by Nature in Western Washington. These panelists represent a cross-section of stakeholders touched by the student debt crisis and its ripple effect across rural communities. So first up, Sophie, could you tell us a little bit about the work you and your team do and how student debt affects your coalition members? Specifically, what are things that people may not understand about how student debt weighs down farmers and the larger agricultural sector?
Yes, absolutely. And thank you so much for having me and hosting this important conversation. The National Young Farmers Coalition, we are a grassroots advocacy organization of young farmers across the country. working primarily on policy change to address the structural issues that we face getting started and building careers in agriculture, particularly focused on young farmers of color. And we've identified student loans as a key barrier from the beginning of the coalition. In our last national survey, it was the second biggest challenge that young farmers faced after land access. And we know that the two are intimately connected, as when you have student loans, it becomes nearly impossible to afford to buy land. And we've been working on this issue, as Representative Delgado mentioned, primarily through working to add farmers to the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program. Since 2015, we've launched a bipartisan bill, introduced 3 Congresses in a row. We are seeing now, as the Public Service Loan Forgiveness has its issues, that we are really joining this national call for debt cancellation, that this issue is critical for young farmers, but it is affecting all young people, and we're part of that movement for debt cancellation. But I wanted to answer the question about things that people might not know about farming and student loans, and I'm so happy to have Melanie and John here who can have the personal take. The first thing is farming is incredibly capital intensive and it's very risky. So obtaining credit to farm is already extremely difficult. Banks don't want to fund a risky undertaking. With student loans, it can become impossible to get credit to grow your business. The second thing is that a college education is super helpful to farm. So some naysayers might say, oh, you don't need to go to college. Why do you have student loans in the first place? We as a country want young people to bring big, exciting ideas back to the farm and invigorate our rural communities with this knowledge from higher institutions, right? How to fight climate change on our farms, how to build economically viable businesses. It's in our public interest that young people can get an education and still be a farmer. And then the third thing is, it's not just folks who are learning about farming in college have debt and face that barrier of continuing to farm, but we see multi-generational farmers, farm kids, told to get a college education in case it's not feasible to stay on the farm. The 1980s farm crisis is in recent memory. But by going to college, they're taking on student loans, and it makes it often almost impossible to go back to the family farm. So this issue is pervasive. We see it in like 50% of our farmers, and it's a racial equity issue. We see folks of color bearing the brunt of our student loan crisis. And if farmers of color can't farm because student loans, then we're not ever going to have an equitable agriculture. So leave it there.
Thank you so much. And John, you're up next. I think also this is by far the best backgrounds of any panelist we have. And putting my little wall to shame over here. It's great to have you. Could you start by telling us a little bit about yourself, the work you do, and then how student debt has affected you and your ability to work in the sector?
Yep. So my name's John Williams. I'm the farm manager at Sola Gradia Farm here in Urbana. And then in my free time, I co-own, operate with my wife, Red Crib Acres, which is a small apple orchard just outside of town. And I've been at Sola Gradia for 3 years now. I've been in farming for 5 or 6 years. And it's, my student debt that I carry, and now the debt that I share with my wife and I, has really been the forefront of our, one of the first things that we discuss when we talk about, when do we really get to go in feet first on our own farming operation. Right now, both my wife and I farm during the day for a living, and then farm in our evenings and weekends just to because we love what we're doing and we want to provide as much good food to our community, to provide, you know, regenerative practices of growing trees to bring our ecosystems back into alignment. And you know, so we're really passionate about it, but you know, we also do see that someday we will need to really be able to focus on our own business, and student debt is always that first thing that we sort of think about when we're thinking about buying land or purchasing equipment or expanding the orchard, things like that. So it's yeah, it's every day, well, maybe not every day, but at least, you know, a couple times a week, we're thinking about, you know, how does the debt that we carry really affect, you know, our future in farming.
Great. And Melanie, similar to the question for John, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, the work you do, and how student debt has impacted you as a farmer?
Yes, good day, everyone. My name is Melanie Edwards, and I am located in Western Washington on the Olympic Peninsula. And I, similar to John, have been managing a diversified mixed vegetable farm, a 20-acre mixed vegetable farm. And I am in the process of trying to establish my own farm, which is a focus on natural dye plants as well as open pollinated seed. And culturally significant seed to the African diaspora. And some of the challenges that I face with student loan debt is access to capital, access to credit lending institutions, and also, which is also a direct relationship to access to land. And so when I'm trying to start my own farm right now, and there's all this upfront cost and equipment and seeds and tools and land, it's been a huge barrier to be able to kind of hit the ground running. And the pandemic didn't help either, because I did try to start my business in 2020 as well. So right now I'm kind of in this process of seeking funding from grants as well as other open source sources, which is sometimes very helpful, but uh, the grant process is also very limited and has its barriers to it as well.
Thank you so much. Sophie, so some Americans who don't have student debt may think the crisis doesn't play a role in their lives. You see, you know, a lot of times when you're looking at the comments on Twitter or Facebook when talking about student debt, which you should never do, kind of this, you know, this doesn't impact me. I paid off my loans. Why should I be worried about the student debt crisis? But, you know, as we're hearing from you guys, we know that student debt is increasingly a drag on the people who make the food that we eat. And that's certainly a group that plays a key role in everyone's life. So from your perspective, how does the burden of student debt ripple across rural communities themselves and our larger economy?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think just to start of how many services our farmers provide in our communities, you know, of course, they are growing good food that serves the folks in their communities, but they're also stewarding, farmers on a whole steward half of our nation's land mass. So they are in charge, in stewardship of an incredible amount of acreage in our country. And they're also, of course, supporting rural economies. And there are great studies on how dollars spent on local farmers and the dollars local farmers spend has an economic multiplier effect. So we need young people to take on this important task of agriculture and serving as farmers. But student loans are one of the biggest impediments for young people to be able to take that on. So as we've heard, and Melanie and John are like doing it, right? Like have student loans and are making that decision and making it work. But so many young people aren't. I hear it all the time that young people are quitting farming so that they can find more yes, stable income to pay off their monthly student loan payments and other careers. And we're losing that talent from this industry that is incredibly important to the well-being of our country. And I think going back to this issue of economic justice and racial justice, if young people can't get into agriculture because of their student loans, and Black, Indigenous, and people of color have an even harder time doing that work, then we're never going to have a diversity of farmers able to serve the diversity of our communities, because we know that culturally appropriate food comes from farmers who are growing that food for their communities. And so I think we all need to be worried about the problems that student loan debt is causing for the next generation of farmers.
Great. And I think I just want to kind of dig in, especially with Melanie and John, to talk about kind of where the rubber hits the road. So, we've talked a lot about how farming is capital intensive, and being able to access and secure credit is critical to starting and growing your operations. Can you talk a little bit about your experience in this, and kind of for the people watching, kind of just show how, student debt is such a factor in trying to kind of do what you're trying to do? Melanie, that one was for you.
Thank you. Well, student loan debt has definitely been a barrier in accessing financing to support my farm. And so like a lot of people have the opportunity to apply for like USDA loans and FSA loans as well. And as a Black woman, the USDA is not the first institution that I think of as borrowing money from, because of the historic
Discrimination.
Thank you, discrimination that they have shown to Black people farming in America. And so a lot of farmers can use them as a source, but it's definitely not a place that I would consider using. So I do look for private institutions like banks or credit unions, and my credit score is significantly impacted by my student loan debt, and it's often not a source that I can use is by public or private institutions as well. So as I mentioned, I do try and apply for grants, but since I'm not a 501c3, there's very limited grants that I can apply for as well. And so just really, and the grant process is not promised. You could apply for a grant, but it's not guaranteed. So really, like, it's put me in a very serious situation where I do work part-time, and then I do run my farm part-time as well. But similarly, a lot of things have come up this year where it's actually really questioned my, what's next in my life, and farming might not be in my future because it's not something that is easily affordable, or there's just been a lot of challenges and setbacks where, I'm thinking about the future and what the future holds, and it may not be farming, unfortunately.
And John, I think one of the things that came up before, and we spoke about in the prep call, was how more people with a varying sense of backgrounds, across a bunch of college educations, would not only be interested for the agricultural sector, but also good for it. But can you talk a little bit about how you think that student debt is holding back kind of more people from a varying degree of backgrounds from entering the field?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm a great example. I went to Knox College in Galesburg, Illinois, and got a degree in political science, and spent a few years in journalism before deciding I really wanted to do something very physical and very, positive for my community. Not knocking journalism, I still love journalism, but I see a lot of fellow recent grads that want to have sort of a return to the land and really have some concrete positive change for their communities. And they may be coming out of with a college degree in physics or chemistry or public relations, a wide variety of things that really do benefit the work that we do, because everyone knows that a farmer is not only just growing plants and harvesting them, but they're selling the plants, they're marketing the plants, they're PR representatives for their farm and their community. They're chemists, they do all these things that a college degree really can benefit their own operation, but then in turn their community, because many young farmers are quick to share good ideas with each other, or knowledge that they may not commonly come across by like a Google search, or learn from a textbook that they may have gotten from a more rich college education. So I think there's importance that young farmers have not just an ag degree, that they really come out with a wide range of knowledge to help their business grow and put them in a position to succeed.
That's a great point. And something that I learned, right, was the unique nature of how kind of the farm labor market kind of worker paradigm is set up is actually makes the kind of impact of student debt even harder. So Sophie, if you could, I would love to hear from all of you on this, but I think probably a lot of people who are tuning in from the SBPC side, I think are learning a ton just about kind of how people kind of enter the farm, kind of what the work looks like, and how the student debt system is set up makes it particularly hard. So I'd love for you guys to kind of do a little bit of education and a little bit of description about why that's the case.
Yeah, I can start and then I'll pass the mic. One of the most popular dominant ways of getting into agriculture is through the apprenticeship program. It's really valuable to learn how to farm from other farmers, but often apprenticeship programs come with really modest stipends, sometimes housing as well. I did a farm apprenticeship to get started myself. I think it was like $400 a month or something like that. And you have to have privilege to be able to take on that work after graduation, particularly with student loans. That's an incredible investment that you won't be able to make payments during that time, and you're not setting yourself up for success in repayment. And after my husband Andrew has considerable student loan debt and farmed for 8 years, and he did quit because of his student loans, ultimately, because he had the opportunity to, it's funny to call it an opportunity. He had the choice between paying off his student loans or taking on an additional amount of loans to start his farm business. And I think so many people like Andrew are making that decision to get out of debt instead of bury deeper. But you asked specifically about the labor, and the reality is that the economic reality of farming is that labor is the most expensive, part of any farmer's budget, and margins are so slim that the payment that farmers are able to make to their labor is quite low, and makes it almost impossible to pay student loans while earning that income. But I'll pass it to the experts.
Well, John, what we talked about too was also just, we hear all the time that it's a challenge in rural economies to try to keep up with, paying wages that can afford $300, $400, $500 a month student loan payment when, the average stipend is $400 a month. So how have you seen kind of in terms of retaining employees, attracting employees? It's just, the margins probably are so tough to try to pay people what they need to kind of accommodate their student debt.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I have to recognize all the privilege that I got in my start. My first year I was an apprentice, not making a lot of money. I was living in my parents' barn and driving an hour to go to the nearest organic vegetable farm, and it was a lot of work, but it was also a whole lot of privilege. And you know, for me, it's been this cycle of you know a lot of the farm hand work is you you only make enough to sort of make a living, and then so you get into this cycle of needing to do the income-based repayment where you're not paying off hardly any of the loan, and at maybe just chipping away at some of the interest payments. And you know I see it with my employees. We're in a college town, so a lot of our new farm hands are recent college graduates, and they really sort of see farming as a nice sort of stopgap between graduating and their career. But it's hard to find the encouragement and the blue skies that you'll make enough that you can pay off that student loan debt that is quite looming right when you get out of college. So we often lose really great people, really smart, talented people to other jobs that can pay better, and that can provide a very constant year-round wage that at least in vegetable farming it's really hard to do, to really be able to pay people 12 months out of the year.
Yeah. And then Melanie, something I learned from you was also just the nature of getting paid usually once a month, which I think is uncommon for most people, and how you've seen that just kind of go sideways with student loan payments.
Yes, yes. Actually, I similarly have I have a degree not in farming. I have a degree in culinary arts, which actually led me to farming. And I left a really cushy corporate job in a large corporate account here in Washington to go and farm. And it was something that I was like really passionate about, especially being a Black woman wanting to know more about where our food came from, and why at the time I didn't see a lot of Black people represented in agriculture. And so I quit my cushy job and I went and farmed on a small sustainable farm. And I went from getting paid, about an annual salary of like, $60,000 a year to getting paid about $600 a month. And so when I really thought about like how, in addition to the savings that I had and how I could afford to farm without relying on credit, I had to really scale back a lot of things, like managing subscriptions and just really focusing on what was really important to pay or to, help me live. It's a huge privilege to be able to go and work on a farm and get paid $600 a month, because it really is only paying for the bare basics. We're talking like your car payment and your insurance and maybe a cell phone, and that's about it. So if even, so it was a really hard choice for me to do, and it put me actually. It made it so that I wasn't able to make the student loan payments that I was previously paying, because at the end of the month, and after maybe you buy a little bit of food or something like that, at the end of the month, there's not a lot of money left after $600. And especially here in Washington State, where we have one of the highest tax rates as well. And so it's really hard for young people coming into farming to actually sustain themselves. And then, I was fortunate enough where the farm provided housing for us. But here in Washington State, we have a huge housing crisis. We're like one of the most expensive states. We're right up there with New York and DC and the price of rent. And so as a young farmer, when you leave that farm, or if you're looking for your own housing that's not like a tiny shack on a farm, which is literally what housing is, which is great. It's a great experience. I loved it. I lived in a camper. But when you are looking for your own housing, it's hard to be able to afford it. And so I'm fortunate where I'm in a rural community where there are a lot of small efficiencies where you can afford living, but it's still not like, the type of living that a lot of people would like. It's kind of unfair for young farmers to only be able to have like small dwellings or like, a camper or like a shack. We would like, the quality of life and living as well, but it's just not something that's not attainable.
And then Sophie, we talked a little bit about the ag schools and ag school systems. And so what's your general take on, the cost of going to these schools, how they're affecting who's going into farming after graduation, and how that's tied up into kind of some of the student debt challenges that we see kind of really impacting rural communities and farms?
Yeah, one of the advocates in our campaign, Meredith from University of Maryland, deals with this challenge every day of teaching. She trains farmers through a sustainable ag program and is giving them the education on how to farm. But meanwhile, they're also have high tuition costs and are accumulating, for the most part, student loan debt. And her experience is how many of the folks that she's training are, not able to actually pursue careers in agriculture because of that cost of that program. So I don't have good stats on how much ag schools cost right now, but I know that we need a really dedicated investment for young people to get a training in agriculture and not come away from that training with debt, because what is the point of providing it if folks can't farm after, right? We're just feeding, folks into ag industry jobs, which isn't what we need. We need to replace our aging farm population. We need production farmers. We need folks ready and able to fight climate change on their farms and grow culturally appropriate food, as I mentioned. So yeah, we're definitely in support of any and all proposals to make community college programs for agriculture free or low cost, ag programs, but I think also recognizing the importance of non quote unquote agriculture jobs or non-agriculture programs, and supporting young people to pursue those and then go into agriculture. Because as we see, we have great examples of farmers who've gotten so much out of studying journalism, culinary arts, or communications, or biology, horticulture, or anthropology, like my husband Andrew. So the point is we need to encourage and invest in young people going into agriculture, no matter what sort of education they think is the most helpful to that end.
Great. And so I think one of the questions we got from the audience is an awesome one, is I think this is for the whole group, whoever can weigh in, which is so how well do you think the larger agricultural community, if such a thing exists, like recognizes that student debt is such a crisis, is impacting folks like you all, and is imperiling like the future generation of farmers? Is it well known? Is this something where there's a lot more education that needs to happen? I think we'd love to hear from all of you guys on this. Melanie, why don't you go first?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think when we talk about like smaller agriculture, smaller scale farmers, I think that is a conversation that a lot of us are having, because a lot of us are first generation farmers. So I think that it's pretty well amongst that community, in my opinion. However, I think that when it comes to like larger ag, it might not be very well known, mostly because it's farms that are passed down from generation to generation, where they have that generational wealth and access to land and capital. So I think that this is a conversation that's happening constantly. And we see this in our our farm report that we had from the National Young Farmers Coalition. It was a huge concern. So I think that younger generation farmers are thinking about it and talking about it.
John?
Yeah, I mean, I think Melanie's spot on there. You know, we definitely, my fellow young farmers that are doing the small scale ag are talking about it. It's a big concern about not only us who are currently farming, but those who want to get into farming, or yeah, want to find a way to quit their day job and get into farming. But you know, here in Central Illinois, we are surrounded by large farms that are, you know, hundreds and thousands of acres, running equipment that is, you know, certainly pales in comparison to our student loan debt. So I feel like the larger ag community is really concerned about, you know, land prices and equipment prices, which, you know, we're certainly on a sort of a different scale. We have those same concerns, but our equipment doesn't cost $750,000. So, you know, you know, Melanie's right that like so many farms around here are passed down generation to generation. And you know, I couldn't even imagine how you would get into corn and soy, big ag production without that kind of benefit, that privilege. So it's a much smaller conversation in the ag community as a whole.
And Sophie, I'd love your perspective too in the larger kind of ag advocacy world, how you see this and how well or how it's not recognized in kind of the larger suite of concerns.
Yeah, I mean, it's not a traditional agriculture issue. When we started working on this campaign in 2015, there was no conversation about student loans amongst the key players, you know, the Farm Bureau and the National Farmers Union and others. And I think the campaign, our Farming's Public Service campaign, has been really successful of creating the narrative around student loans as a key barrier preventing young farmer success. So we've done the good, you know, communications and narrative work and sharing farmer stories, which is so critical. But we haven't won our campaign yet. You know, student loans is still just as much, if not more, of a barrier now than it was in 2015. And so we see our role in advocacy of being the young farmer voice in this larger movement to address student loan debt. Our federal policy director, Vanessa Garcia Polanco, was a huge part of a letter of like 450 or something organizations calling for the, you know, executive action on student loans. And to see in that press release about student loan debt, you know, of the young farmer voice front and center, that's huge. That student loan debt affects so many communities and occupations and careers, but it has a particularly it's a particularly risky threat for our farm communities. So yeah, I think we've really been able to bring an issue that is not an agriculture issue to the forefront of our agriculture crisis. And I think now it's time to win.
That's awesome. So I think we have time for 2 more questions. I think we want the whole group to answer. So I thought this one was really interesting. I'll add a little color, right? So I think beyond just your farms, right, thinking about yourselves as like leaders and key constituents in your communities. So besides just farming, how do you see debt affecting the people and the towns around you? I'm guessing this is meant to see just kind of the impact in student debt, just in rural communities at large, and kind of how you see that taking a toll. Melanie, why don't you go first?
Yeah. Okay, so how do I see debt affecting the community around me? Well, I will say that I'm in a fairly small. Sorry. I'm in a fairly small community, and one of the things, in addition to our farmers having, or younger farmers having challenges and barriers to entry and accessing land, here in this community specifically, there's a huge housing crisis. And so, in addition to people wanting to move here and live here, there's really no place for them to live. And I think that debt has a huge factor in that, because a lot of the younger generation people that are moving or trying to sustain lifestyles in these rural communities, they can't afford the housing that is available. That's in the like 2000 price range. So I think that the debt crisis has a lot to do with access to land and access to sustainable living as well. Because if we don't have people living here, if we don't have people working here, then we're not sustaining the community, and this community will, or could, die eventually, because we do have a majority older population of people that are living here. And so we really want to encourage young people moving here, but we can't do that without the infrastructure, without young people having the finances that they need to sustain themselves as well. Sorry about the dogs barking.
Oh, it's great. John, I think the same question. What do you see in the community around you outside of just your farm or your neighbors' farms, just in terms of the impact student debt is having on rural communities?
Yeah, I mean, I think for the big one that we see as vegetable farmers is, people really being cautious about how they spend their food dollars. There's a lot of people who really struggle, who are just out of college, who really struggle to feed themselves. And, when you have a limited food dollar, you are going to spend it somewhere where you can get a cheaper calorie, even if it's not the most healthy thing for you. So it's sort of a chicken before the egg kind of situation where, if young people aren't going to be the ones shopping for fresh local food at the farmer's market or at their grocery store, then that hurts us cyclically speaking. And so, I think it affects us in how we choose to feed ourselves, how we choose to, where we choose to live. And then, in turn, rural communities oftentimes aren't filled with jobs that, people can support themselves. So, lower paying jobs can be, a challenge for someone who's a recent grad to step into, because they have that debt load coming out of college. So yeah, I mean, it's all around us. It's, not only our debt hurts our farming operations future, but, the debt of the community around us as a whole is really a big factor.
Sophie, do you want to answer that one too?
I mean, I don't think I could say it any more perfectly than that. Yeah, I mean, we don't have enough young people living and farming, but living in rural America, right? And that, just as John and Melanie are saying, we need customers to be farmers. And so this is a generational issue, and relief for our non-farming community members will have a positive impact on our operations as well.
All right, so last question to wrap it up, and I think kind of it's two questions, but the same side, I think, of the coin is, what do you say to those who say or think that, student debt is a big city urban problem, a bunch of people who went to Harvard, and what's your response to them, and also in terms of what would student loan relief mean to you and your life and your goals, and I think larger community. So not to put too big of a question before you to close, but Melanie, why don't you go first?
Well, I mean, I think the reality is that no matter if you come from a rural community or a city, education is important to everyone. And I think that everyone should have access to be able to get the education that they would like. And I think the fact that how expensive education has become is really like, it's a huge burden for people. And it puts a lot of limitations on lower income people who would like to pursue education but can't. So I think, it's not just a city thing. It's, we have a graduating class. They're celebrating actually here at the farm that I'm at right now. And they're all young rural kids that are moving to go to different colleges, and they may or may not return to this community. And really, we want to encourage them to come back to their community and either steward the land or build like whatever business that they want. So I think that everyone has the right to get an education, and student loan debt affects everyone, and especially these really rural communities. I don't know if that answered the question or not.
It definitely does. John?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, it's an urban problem because the choice that people who come from rural communities, if they choose to go and get an education, oftentimes their choice is to have to move to the city, and oftentimes against their, in well wishes or intentions, because that's where they can find the job that can help pay off their student debt. And so, to see revitalization in our rural communities, we have to be able to, have jobs that people coming out of college can take on and be able to afford all their, their living expenses and student debt expenses. And then that will in turn, help, grow our rural communities, which are, a great place to be. I mean, I'm not moving to a city anytime soon. Sometimes I think Champaign-Urbana is big enough as it is, so, I think it needs to be a, rural, urban, suburban discussion, because, people getting college educations are coming from all those communities and are choosing to go to certain communities over others because that's where they can afford.
Sophie, to round us out.
Yeah, I mean, farming is our rural jobs. They're green jobs. Like, it's such a way for us to rebuild our rural communities. And we know that, not to discount urban agriculture, like so incredibly important, and where there's so much innovation and diversity in agriculture. But when we're thinking about rural issues, like agriculture is like the Green New Deal for our communities, is these jobs in agriculture, right? And we have a succession problem because we have farmers aging out and retiring. Our average age of farmers is nearly 60. In the last census, young farmers increased by 2%, farmers over 65 by 11%. So we're having this enormous transition to agriculture, the next generation. But all of our young farmers have student loan debt and can't take on the operations, can't buy the land from the farmers, can't get the credit to go their farms. And so it's an incredible threat to the future of our rural communities. And we know when farms close, the schools close, the main streets close. Like, it sounds like a trope, but when you talk to a young farmer in a rural area, they're like, yeah, like it literally, that happens and then that happens. So yeah, student loans, it's not an urban issue. It's like really something that we need to think about addressing to ensure that our rural spaces are surviving.
Well, somehow we have burned through our entire hour in what seems like a very incredibly short amount of time. So I wanted to thank all of you guys for what you do and taking a little bit of time out of your very, very busy schedules to talk about this. I wanted to thank Representative Delgado for his powerful remarks. And we are going to be posting the recording of today's event will be made available, and we're going to share that soon. And just wanted to thank everyone again for tuning in, and thank all of our panelists, and hope everyone has a great day.